Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Pleasure to welcome back to the program Jostein Hauge. Is a political economist, assistant professor at Cambridge, and publisher of the Global Currents newsletter on Substack. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me back on, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm very happy you're here because it has almost gotten to the point where it's almost impossible for me anyways, and I would imagine for a good number of our audience, to follow just how effed up our trade policy is, to the extent that there's actually a policy. Can you give us a sense of what has or was looking like it was going to be? I mean, we sort of got tacoed again, I guess, maybe with Trump in terms of China. But what's going on with the with China's I guess reciprocity to our trade war overtures?
Yeah, so the technicalities here are a bit complicated to lay out, but actually it's quite simple to understand the reasoning behind China's response, because what China's done
what are they responding to? Like, which series of tariffs are they responding to at this point?
So in many ways, what China's done now is what they've done previously, which is try to somewhat mirror what the US is doing. And they're trying, especially to the US, to signal and tell the US, you don't really want to mess with us. So in the past few months, and a lot of people don't know this, the Trump administration has enacted a lot of trade restrictions and policies during this so-called truce between China and the US. And this has now upset China to the degree that are saying, okay, we're going to do something quite powerful. We're going to put restrictions on exports of a lot of rare earth metals and also machinery and technology associated with that, to really make it known to the US that we're not messing around. So that's China's recent response. In many ways, it mirrors that of the US in terms of, okay, you do this, we do that. We're happy to play the tit for tat with you in the trade policy game. Now, this is a bit different because the reach of the export restrictions are global. So they're not only applied to the US, they're applied to the world, essentially. So why are they global if they want to target the US? Well, the US's policies are global, and they target Chinese businesses in other parts of the world. So China's response is also global. But China is now also trying to send a signal to the rest of the world, and especially Europe, saying, hey, you can see now what we're doing to the US, and this is also our line that we're going to play if people want to bully us. We cannot be bullied.
Okay, so wait, I want to just step back a little bit. Can you, when we talk about export restrictions, can you, walk us through what that means in lay people's terms, and then B, what restrictions have we put on our exports to China, and if you have any sense of why? I mean, my initial guess would be because some guy that Donald Trump knows came into his office and said, this would be helpful to me, and I will buy a bunch of your crypto or whatever. But can you walk us through like what we mean but when we say export restrictions? Because generally people just assume, okay, we're just putting tariffs, import taxes on them. The export restrictions are part of creating an industrial policy. But what's weird about this era is that we have all the tools of an industrial policy are being utilized, but we have no industrial policy.
Yeah. This is something that I think is quite, and before I get to the restrictions here, it's quite apparent to a lot of people who study these kinds of policies, because tariffs and export restrictions and trade interventions can be used for the purpose of building up an industrial base. But since Trump started the tariffs, there hasn't really been a lot of economic logic behind his trade policies. It seemed to be a negotiation tool for him to flex without thinking too much about the economic rationale here. And you see that when you talk to manufacturing firms across the United States that are saying this is creating uncertainty for us, this is rising the cost of inputs for us, etc. So it's pretty clear that Trump's policies are not having the intended effect, or if that's even his intention, to create a strong industrial base. Now, export restrictions can work in many ways, right? You can simply restrict the exports of certain goods to a certain country, like the U.S., for example, did with advanced chips to China for a long time. Then it turned out that China was able to eventually make these themselves, so it backfired. What China has done now is basically made it harder for Chinese firms to export rare earth elements themselves, and also technologies associated with rare earths, like magnets, for example. So they're saying you need to consult with the government before you export this, and we give ourselves the right to basically deny you exporting these goods. And that's very consequential in this rare earth supply chain, because China is now processing roughly 90% of rare earths, and they produce a lot of the technology associated with that. So, rare earths are used in tons of different technologies, the defense sector. They're used in magnets that are in consumer electronics. They're used in clean energy manufacturing and so on. So it has consequences, and a lot of people are terrified now because this supply chain is very much in control of China's hands.
My understanding is that despite their name, the rare earth metals are sort of like a second order issue as to the capacity and ability to process them. And that's where China really has an advantage, and where theoretically we could get these rare earth metals, but the processing of them, we just don't have any of the elements, workforce and industrial base, to do that type of work.
Yes, you're correct here. So there's there's a misunderstanding among a lot of people right now, which makes complete sense, which is that these rare earth metals are actually rare. They simply refer to a range of metals in the periodic table, and they're called this due to certain chemical and historical reasons. So we should be clear about that they're not actually, or not necessarily, rare. Some of them are rare. So, for example, metals like lithium and cobalt, they're not rare earth metals, but lithium is in very high demand, and it's considered a critical mineral or a critical metal. So some rare earth metals are critical, but some critical metals are not rare earth metals. So, yeah, it's confusing to a lot of people.
Okay, so the U.S. has sort of been chipping away at these or adding export restrictions. China has now said, we're going to show you that we have more capacity than you think we do. And it's also saying to third parties, I guess, do not export any of our technology or our processed goods of this type to the United States, or you're not going to get them anymore either. Is that basically it?
I think they're trying to do that by making this rule or these exports restrictions global. Yes, but I'm quite confident that if the Trump administration wants to have an amicable trade relationship with China, they're happy to have an amicable trade relationship. I think China is more than anything signaling something to the U.S. here. I don't think they have a desire, or there's no indication that China has a desire to limit, the access that other countries have to these things over the long term. But they definitely want to tell the U.S., the world, and especially the U.S., that, hey, we've gotten to a point now where we can do these things. Our productive capabilities across a range of sectors, industries, and technologies is so strong now that you cannot simply bully us. And it really has become that strong.
Well, can you speak about that strength? When you were on last, we spoke about the paper that you had written, The New Economic Nationalism, where you studied industrial policy and the different approaches in the US, China, and the EU. And you were making the case that the US has been incredibly hawkish, and that over the past decade or so, China has really ramped up its industrial policy internally in ways where it seems like the United States should have or should know the basic facts about how much China has progressed in its ability to create these things domestically. Like that reality was always obvious, but why is the US so slow to understand China's leverage here?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of the developments that we've seen in terms of China's industrial competitiveness have taken a lot of people by surprise across the world, not only the US. I was quite shocked when I saw how far China had advanced in artificial intelligence and developing capabilities to produce parts for advanced chips across the entire supply chain. So I do think it's starting to take a lot of people by surprise, but now realizing that the capabilities are strong. If you look at industrial policy in the rare earth supply chain, it's interesting because it goes back to the 1980s, and it goes to show how extremely long-term minded that the Chinese government has been, and how extremely clever they've been with industrial policy over a very long time, which contrasts the US, where you've had certain efforts to do industrial policy here and there, but generally it's been very hard to plan. You've had presidential administrations that have basically tried to undo what the previous administration has done. And I think most importantly in the US, you've had a for-profit financial sector that has much more control and has chased short-term profits, whereas in China, you haven't had that. You've had the state that's been able to basically discipline capital and say, here's what we want to do. We're going to do it long term. Of course, you need really, really capable, skilled people at the helm to be able to do this, and China has had that.
It really does seem like the ability to say to for-profit entities that your profit's going to be X, as opposed to X plus. Like, so for instance, I mean, if we need housing, it may not be, 10X profitable for you, but it's going to be 2% profitable. And that's what you're going to do. It's some measure of being able to sort of say, you're going to produce even beyond a certain measure of what would be profitable, because this is what we need under an industrial policy. My understanding too is that as late as 2022, like helium, which apparently is involved in these processes, processing of rare earth metals, China was dependent on outside sources for helium, like 95%. And over the course of just 2 or 3 years, was able to rely on the outside sources for helium to around 5%. And that they have been like actively sort of saying like, we now have more leverage in these areas, and they're exercising them now.
Yeah, it boggles the mind. When China says they're going to do something or plans to do something, they do it, and they don't underperform. They often overperform. I also think it was, recently Xi spoke at a climate summit and laid out sort of the targets that China have for carbon reductions in the future. And some people said that, China isn't ambitious enough. They need to reduce their emissions more than he's planning to do. And most likely they will. But when China says they're going to do something, they will do it. And oftentimes they will actually overperform. That's also happened with Made in China 2025, which was this huge industrial policy plan published in China in 2015 that aimed to make China a global leader in a range of industries. And 10 years later, when they were supposed to achieve these things, they had overperformed.
And as far as climate change, I mean, for years, the argument was there's no point in the U.S. doing anything. And this is what we heard from the right. there's no point in the U.S. doing anything because China China now seems to have like completely lapped us in solar power generation, and of course like EVs. It's just I don't even think like if Americans understood what a Chinese EV vehicle was selling for and how far it could go, I think there'd be some type of revolt in this country. The latest reporting from Reuters is that the U.S., and it's hard to know at this point whether it's just sort of a threat or not, has drafted countermeasures if negotiations fail with China that include requiring export licenses for software sent to China. If they were to do this, aren't we looking at basically like China basically then saying, okay, we're going to make our own software and basically do to software what they did to electric vehicles? Like, I mean, if the U.S. does this, for someone who doesn't want to maybe pay for, Microsoft operating system, it feels like I'm 16 months away from getting an open source version of a Microsoft operating system that's going to be 1/10 the cost.
Yeah, I think what happened in semiconductors is the best parallel here, because that's the sector where the U.S. was trying to formulate policy to prevent China from having access to advanced chips, and China essentially said, "That's fine, we'll just make these chips ourselves," and they started doing that now. At this point, the technological capabilities in China are so strong and so broad-based that yes, I do think you're right. We might end up seeing this happening, but you mentioned Taco in the very beginning. Trump always chickens out, and this is the outcome that I think we'll see yet again. Trump likes to pretend that he is this. He knows the art of the deal and he knows how to be an effective bully, etc. But China just has so much leverage in the sphere of international trade right now that this is not someone you can bully. And I think this is a mindset that's been part of American politics, and especially U.S. administrations for years, that we will bully developing countries to do what we want, and if they are a threat, if their sovereign, independent development are a threat to us, we'll use international trade sanctions, et cetera, and we'll get what we want. And this mentality with China will have to change, because China has now. Without a doubt, they have successfully, an independent, embarked on an economic development path that's independent, that's sovereign, that's in many ways goes against U.S. imperialist ambitions. And at this point, it's really hard for the U.S. Ruling class to do anything about it. So this kind of approach isn't going to work with China.
I know this is an impossible thing to divine, but do you have a sense of like who understands this in this administration, or even within the context of like these circles, and who doesn't? I mean, Scott Bessant is on there yesterday saying that these export controls that China's talking about with rare is a sign of their weak economy, which you would have a better sense than I, but I imagine it sounds like, we're gonna talk a lot of bluster, but like, who's the audience for that? Like, the stock market, reacted for the first time in months and months because of China's threat. So it feels like the investor class understands how strong China is. I can't figure out, like, who is Trump doing this for?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that, other than I think we just need to understand Trump's personality here, and the fact that he's also threatening with tariffs, and he just loves tariffs, and he loves to he loves to embrace this personality of a bully. But in DC, generally there seems to be more people are understanding the strength of China's economy. there are, you can point out to some problems in China's economy, like, consumption or like deflationary pressures, etc., that are more, I think, about what's going on in the short term. But when it comes to long-term strength, when it comes to really the foundations of what builds a strong economy, having, developed capabilities in producing a lot of high-tech stuff also at an incredibly cheap price, which not enough people are talking about. Being able to do this, China is doing this right now across a range of sectors. So they've set them, even with, even if you can agree that there are certain short-term wobbles in the Chinese economy, they've set themselves up for really strong success in the long term.
And do you think that so far it seems like the people who understand that ultimately get Trump's attention one way or another, and then he starts to sort of back down and just, I don't know, puff up his chest and then pretend like something else is happening or something?
I think we'll see this. We'll see some kind of solution between the two countries soon, because the economic dependence between them is just so strong. Although they're gradually, the trade dependence between China and the U.S. is vice versa, is lower than it was, say, in 2015. So both countries are somewhat decoupling from one another, although China's exports are still surging. But it's what strikes me is that in the administration right now, there seems to be this idea that China is the country that's retaliating, and this is what doesn't make sense to me, because if you start analyzing the pattern, you see a Chinese response to certain policies enacted by Trump, and smart people should be able to see that it's the Chinese responding here with aggressive policies. They're not the ones starting to bark up the tree.
He's out there saying that it's a hostile act by China not to buy U.S. soybeans, and threatening for us to develop our own cooking oil, I guess, industry. It's nuts, and a lot of people are getting crushed economically in this country from it. And I think we'll have a better sense of that once we start to get some numbers at one point. But anything else you think we should be looking out for in the coming weeks?
Well, there's one thing, one area where you can argue that the Chinese have done things, not unfairly, I would say, but, they've had a strong and powerful state that has used industrial policy actively for many years. And this is where the U.S. administration seems to be also reacting to, in addition to the trade interventions. I don't think personally that this is unfair practices by China, simply using the state or using subsidies to develop industry. The U.S. did that for a long time with its own tech industry, with DARPA, with defense, with the military-industrial complex, and so on. So every sovereign state should have the ability to do that. I think we'll just have to wait and see for the next Xi-Trump meeting to see what the outcome is. But we are seeing a pattern here emerging that Trump does something, China responds, and then there is some kind of truce. So that's my prediction, that we'll have TACO again, that some kind of trade relations will normalize, but that both countries are trying to use trade to signal to the other their strength, and that China is more successful at doing it, and that they actually also have more leverage in these trade negotiations.
There's a real quality to this. When I was 12, I had two cousins who were twins, and they were like 5, and I would wrestle with the two of them. And then they moved away and came back like 6 to 8 years later. And I realized I'm in big trouble now. And that sort of feels like what's going on.
I think that's a good analogy. Yeah. I one thing I heard, this is very funny. More and more commentators in the US are explicitly saying now we have to become Chinese. We have to become China. And this is a line I hadn't heard until very recently.
Well, we'll see. Jostein Hauge, political economist, publisher of the Global Currents newsletter on Substack. We will link to that at majority.fm and on the podcast and YouTube description. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.